Hi, my name is Brittany J Jones. In this video, I am going to be showing you how to install gathers using 2 rows of basting stitches. This is one of the most common ways for installing gathers, and it works beautiful for lightweight fabrics. I will be sharing in another video how you can do gathers using yarn, dental floss, or twine if you already have those things at home, and that method works amazing for mid to heavyweight fabrics. I must say, when you are doing gathers, it's important to use some sort of basting stitch. Basting stitches allows you to not only have more control of the fabric, but it also allows you to be able to distribute them evenly to match up to the pattern piece that you're going to attach it to. To get a basting stitch on your sewing machine, we do need to adjust our stitch length. Now, because all of our sewing machines are different, I do recommend that you refer to your sewing machine handbook. That way you can see exactly how you need to adjust your stitch length. Some of our machine stitch lengths can go up to a 5.0, 6.0, 10.0. That's why it's so important to refer to your machine manual to see exactly how far your stitch length goes up and how to make that adjustment. We're going to be using that stitch length in this tutorial to create 2 rows of basting stitches to make gathers on our fabric. Let's get started. When preparing to gather fabric, we must first adjust the tension on our sewing machine. For my machine here, I have a regular 2.5 stitch, and I'm just going to lengthen out my stitch. So from 2.5, my machine goes up to a 5.0. This is the stitch length that I will use to gather fabric. I'm not going to sew directly on my seam line, which is 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to come in at 1/2 inch, and then I will do the next one at 1/4 inch away. So the first one I'm going to do at 1/2 inch now, and again I'm going to start 5/8 of an inch in because we don't want any gathers in our seam allowance here. So ensure that you are starting far enough in so that when you do stitch your side seams together in your garment, there are no basting stitches in your seam allowance. I'm approaching my seam here, so I'm just going to come up to that stitch, and then I'm going to pull and leave thread tails. Now that we have one of our gathering rows sewn, I'm going to stitch the other one, and again I'm going to come in closer inside the seam allowance. So I'm going to do this one at about 1/4 inch. Okay, I have my 2 rows of gathering stitches on my fabric, and this is how it looks, just like this. So on one side of the fabric, I'm going to grab a pin. I'm going to place my pin right here beside where I started my basting stitch, and I have all 4 threads in my hand now. I'm just going to start wrapping them in a figure 8 around the pin. This is just going to secure them in place and keep them here as I start to pull on the basting stitch to gather the fabric. So we have that there. That's not going to go anywhere. And I am going to pull on my basting stitch. I used the white thread for my bobbin threads. So I'm going to grab those 2 threads here. And again, we did not backstitch. We just left some long tails. I'm going to start to pull on these threads to gather the fabric. You will continue gathering until you gather up to the pattern piece that you're going to attach it to. So whether you're going to attach it to a bodice or to a waistband, you will just continue pulling up your threads until it meets that fabric. Once you have them matched up, you want to secure these sides here. And I'm just going to use the pin the same way that we did on the other side. And I'm just going to wrap it around in a figure 8 just to hold it in place while I distribute the gathers evenly. So once you have it gathered to where it meets the piece that you're going to attach it to, follow along with your sewing directions once you have your gathers gathered up and evenly distributed. For me, when sewing gathers, you'll normally see it in your pattern instructions to stitch your first line on your seam line, which is your 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, unless it's otherwise noted. But for the most part, it will say seam line, so that would be your 5/8 of an inch line. For me personally, I like to move in a little bit more inside of my seam allowance at about 1/2 of an inch, and then I do my second row at 1/4 of an inch. I do this because once I have my gathers attached to the pattern piece and sewn, I want to be able to pull out my basting stitches without them getting tangled up in my permanent stitch. When you are sewing gathers and your pattern piece is just one big long piece, and I'm meaning that it's not attached on the side seams, you don't want to start your gathers directly on the edge of your fabric, and here's why. When you get ready to gather up your fabric, you don't want gathers inside of your seam allowance. You want that to be flat. So whenever you're just going to gather one flat piece of fabric, always start 5/8 of an inch in. That way you don't have any gathers inside of your seam allowance. If you have two very long pattern pieces that are already sewn together, let's just say, for example, that you are doing gathers on a project and you already have the side seam sewn and you just need to make 2 rows of gathering stitches around the top. I would recommend doing this in sections. Sections would make it so much easier for you to gather pieces at a time, as opposed to doing 2 very long basting stitches. When you get ready to pull those up, you run the risk of those threads popping. So I would suggest, if you have 3 panels or even 2 panels of fabric that needs gathering, do 1 panel at a time. There are a few ways to secure your basting stitches, so when you go to pull up on the threads, you don't just pull out all the threads. One way is to use a pin. You can just put it on one side of your basting stitches and do a figure 8 to just lock those stitches in place, so when you pull from the other side, you're not pulling out your threads. You can also do this with your yarn, twine, or dental floss. That will secure it in place, again, while you are pulling up the gathers on the other side. Another way to secure your stitches while you're pulling them is to do a back stitch only on one side. Now, I would recommend sticking with the pin and doing the figure 8 until you're more comfortable with doing the back stitch. Once you have the gathers in your fabric, take your time to distribute them evenly. We don't want one section to have more gathers than the other, so just make sure that you secure your basting stitches and then take your time to distribute all of your gathers.